So welcome everybody to this Ipsos Views podcast, where once again I have the very great pleasure of welcoming our global CEO, Mr. Ben Page. And to make it an even greater pleasure, for me at least, we are meeting for the first time on one of these podcasts face to face. And so we're actually talking the old-fashioned way. So welcome, Ben. It is quite literally good to see you again.
And you. You haven't aged a day.
I wish that were true. I wish it was. Anyway, as 2022 lurches towards the finish line, we're going to take a few moments to look back over the year and what we think some of the defining global themes of the year have been and how they've been experienced in different parts of the world. So I think the good place to begin, given that it is an ever-present issue and it is a truly global one, is around the environment and the climate crisis, the unfolding climate crisis. A year ago, around this time last year I think it was, we ran a survey in 33 different countries asking people to tell us their expectations for 2022, and on average around 6 in 10 of the people we asked told us they expected more extreme weather events in their country in 2022 than there had been in 2021. Now, if anything, that turned out to be a little bit optimistic. So after another year of record-breaking weather events all around the world and lots of evidence that the climate crisis is at real risk of spiralling out of control, have you noticed any commensurate shifts in public opinion over the last year?
I think overall, people acknowledge, and our data shows very clearly, that it's one of the things that unites people globally is actually the concern about climate change. The problem is that in terms of things like the cost of living crisis, which is present all over the world, the inflation surge post-COVID and the energy crisis with the Ukrainian-Russian conflict or the invasion of Ukraine, that what happens is that in terms of immediate action, it always gets pushed down the list unfortunately by both most governments and consumers in terms of what we actually do about it. And it's going to take some real shocks, I think, which we haven't quite had yet, to see a sustained investment of the type that we might need to stick to, say, 1.5%, 1.5 degrees warming.
So there's no particularly pronounced evidence then that the public around the world is more concerned about this than they were 12 months ago?
On most measures they are more concerned, but I think the point I'm trying to make is that yes, people will say they're concerned. They're concerned about lots of things. The challenge is when you ask them to look at a range of choices, unfortunately, people will say that on balance, the economy and their personal economic well-being in the short term is more important right now than fixing climate change in the longer term. So there's a sort of hope that we see time and time again that somebody else will fix it. Perhaps the government, perhaps business, perhaps technology and scientists. Somehow a solution will be found. And people, need leadership, quite frankly, to make the moves that are necessary. And that's where people are. That hasn't really shifted. There's some signs, but unfortunately, I think for mass opinion, it will take some really sizable shocks before we see mass adaptation. COVID shows that mass adaptation can happen very rapidly, but the shocks will need to be very large indeed. And the problem with the sort of grey rhino rather than black swan of climate change is that we know it's there, it's rumbling towards us, but it's still quite a long way off in the distance. And meantime, I need to get some food in or something. And so we'll worry about that before. That's a long way away still.
I think on the cost of living issue, we've discovered recently that different parts of the world, again, are reacting in different ways, although, as you quite rightly point out, the inflation and rising prices are being experienced almost everywhere in the world, that different parts of the world are reacting somewhat differently in terms of their outlook. And so countries which maybe in recent years have been less prone to economic crises and inflation are actually seem to be getting affected more deeply by it in terms of their views.
I think one of the things that's interesting is when we look around the world for our clients, countries like Britain, which are, by global standards relatively well off, have become incredibly pessimistic. Belgium too, etc. And the French, parts of America. Whereas actually countries that have much lower incomes, like Mexico or South Africa, are actually less pessimistic, interestingly, about the future, despite facing huge problems, incredibly high levels of corruption, unemployment, etc. And it's almost as though those populations in some parts of the world are more used to crisis and a bit of chaos, whereas Europe is sort of waking up to it, or has woken up to it more recently.
Well, we'll return to crisis in a moment, actually, but you did mention Britain there, and I can't let that moment slide by, because I know we try not to be too British on this podcast.
But we are British, unfortunately. Or fortunately, depending on your point of view.
I will say, personally, I feel quite lucky to be British. I'm not a huge patriot. I don't have a Union flag in my house. At the moment, I do have a St George's Cross on display, but that is because of the football, which hopefully will still be on display by the time this podcast goes out. But yes, we try not to be too British here, but it is fair to say that the death of the Queen was a truly global event, whether you're a monarchist or not, whether you're British or not, particularly as it came so soon after her Platinum Jubilee. And there was more eminent commentators than I think it was Sam Friedman, who I think you probably know, observed a very stark contrast between some of those celebrations and the parade of open-top buses going up the mile with loud pop music, Festival of Lurid Colours and Chris Eubank and Tony Blackburn and Rylan and AJ Dudu, and that sort of thing, with the sort of thing we sometimes see in places like Red Square, where we often see missiles pointing at the sky and flyovers, and it's very militaristic. But according to our nation's brand index, which is something we do every couple of years, Britain's international reputation is actually on the slide at the moment. So what do you think we've learned about the institution of monarchy in the 21st century?
First of all, the Queen was an individual as well as part of an institution, and I do think her passing is a sort of bookmark in the end, and signals the real end of the 20th century, because centuries don't really end chronologically. And so the fact that you've had that person and that sort of post-war settlement, which is fraying at the seams, despite some signs of its, it not being broken, given the reaction of the West to Ukraine. Nevertheless, the death of the Queen signals a changing of the guard. Having said that, the monarchy is still a popular institution in Britain, and I note that Prince Charles, now King Charles, his popularity as soon as he became king shot up, because of course he then becomes representative of the institution rather than just him perhaps as the heir to the throne or an individual. So I think it's something that we'll look back on, we'll use as a way of signalling change, particularly as the post-war settlement continues to be under pressure and as we move towards something else potentially, with maybe a real bipolar world. The Russians, of course, also, and Putin's regime also the jokers in the pack. And in a sense, it almost feels like the 2020s at the moment are a period where the old order is dying, to use the phrase from Gramsci in the 20th century. The old order is dying, but the new one is not quite ready to be born. And so, of course, we're too close to the trees, as always, to see the forest. We should do this podcast again in 10 years, Ainsley, if we're both still here, and talk about how right or wrong we were. But it does feel like, with the impacts of COVID and the debt that governments have incurred around the world to deal with that, then the inflationary surge and the energy crisis caused by Putin's invasion of Ukraine, those things come together with things like the ongoing and accelerating climate crisis to mean that we have this sort of polycrisis that we're in the 2020s. It seems very uneven. It will probably all be all right, but it may not.
Well, you couldn't resist mentioning the polycrisis there, so I'm going to bring a question forward that I was going to say for later, which is on precisely that issue, because polycrisis is a word I know that you've become very fond of lately. There's a similar word, permacrisis, which has entered into the Collins English Dictionary as its word of the year recently. The last time we spoke, actually, you sort of rebutted something I was saying by referring back to 100 years ago and 200 years ago, and I wanted to go back to that, because if we consider 1922, an era when I think the greatest European famine of the 20th century was occurring at that point in time in Ukraine and Belarus, actually, after the Civil War, Russian Civil War. There were civil wars all across Europe at that time. The empires were collapsing. There was fighting in Ireland. We're still recovering from a pandemic. We had Mussolini's March on Rome. A gentleman called, well, not a gentleman, but a person called Adolf Hitler was starting to cause ructions in Bavaria and elsewhere. We had the war in Turkey. There was the Popular Rates Rebellion just down the road from here, and the collapse of the Liberal Party here in England and the United Kingdom, and all that entailed for the disruption in our domestic politics. So perhaps with that in mind, 2022 is no different. I mean, it may not be a coincidence that it was exactly 100 years ago, but maybe 2022 is no crazier than any randomly we might pick out from the past?
I think that's a perfectly reasonable comment, and it feels like it when you're in it at the time and you look at it. And of course, the media's job is to make us pay attention, and the way we pay attention is to bad news, not good news. So yes, I think that's a perfectly reasonable point. I suppose the obverse of that is, of course, and look at all of the events of the 20s and then 30s and what they led to in the 1940s, and you would then say, oh dear, I hope the 2040s are not going to be a worse version of the 1940s. So we need to be careful. Only the paranoid survive. But uncertainty prevails. Technology marches on. Overall, though, I still think probably it's better to be alive in 2022 than in 1922 in all sorts of ways for all sorts of people. And we should perhaps remember that. It's probably better to be alive in 2022 than in 1982 for many, many people all over the world. And sometimes we're so close and so focused on our problems and challenges that we fail to step back and look, as you have just done, at the big picture and the longer term. And that is something that's really, really important in our work. If you're just looking at the ticker tape of news or whatever's on your screen when you turn on your mobile phone, you won't see the big picture.
So we love to talk about politics, obviously, here at Ipsos, and populism has been a recurring theme in recent years. There have, of course, in every year, there's always important elections taking place. This year is no different. To the casual observer, there seems to be a bit of a theme developing at the moment that populism, and particularly the populist right, is in retreat, with more centrist technocratic politicians enjoying a bit more success, and Brazil and France and the US midterm has been the most obvious examples, but by no means the only ones. So, but given that some of these outcomes were still pretty finely balanced, and the polling actually in advance of them had a slightly mixed record, not our own, of course, ours is always beyond reproach. How much should we be reading into what seems like the defeat of the populist right?
Well, I think, as you say, it is a narrow thing, and against that I would posit the work that the Sweden Democrats have done, going from 2% of the vote to 20.5%. They were completely beyond the pale in Swedish society 20 years ago. Now they're the second largest party. So populism is there as a symbol or a signal of, literally the revolt against the elites, but that feeling that the future that was promised to people all over the world has not arrived, and therefore populists are able to use that feeling, which is present in many societies, that the growth and prosperity that they were expecting, particularly after what they have seen in recent decades, has stopped or even gone into reverse. And that is fundamentally behind the appeal of populism. So these near-run events, quite frankly, could have gone the other way. And the fundamental forces driving populism have not gone away. So I think things like the Brexit vote, it was a close-run thing, like so many of the major elections that we've had in recent years. It could have gone either way. But I think at this point, the fundamental conditions driving that and those divisions have not gone away and are present in many countries across the world. And again, we don't know ultimately what the conclusion of all of that is. We're too close to the trees right now to see in the forest. But no, it's there. I mean, look, our data this year, 97% in Ecuador, so they don't trust their politicians. I'm assuming the other 3% are either the politicians or somehow related to them. In Bulgaria, a country that's come out of communism and now has free democratic elections, or certainly relatively free elections, only 39% of people bothered to vote in those elections this year in Bulgaria because they had so little confidence in either of the two political parties or major political parties that they were being offered. So I think absolutely these underlying problems are there. And the polycrisis means that we're seeing how interconnected our global economy now is, even if we try and deglobalize, and how things like the unlocking of the COVID restrictions on many economies led to an inflationary surge that central bankers and experts didn't predict because they hadn't really appreciated how sophisticated and interlocked the global economy is. And as we try and unlock or decouple globalization, driven by things like Putin's weaponizing of energy during the Ukrainian conflict, we just find out how interlocked and complex our whole system is. And I think that's one of the challenges. Everything sort of worked, but in ways that nobody completely understood. It's one of the joys of capitalism in some ways. But of course, we're now discovering that resilience, redundancy, and some frameworks are pretty important in places that we may not have thought they were needed before.
We are here today to talk mainly about the past and what we can learn from the past to project into the future, I guess. But I do want to talk about an issue which I think spans not just years, but decades and generations, and will continue to be something that we come back to in the next few years, I think, which is the ageing of our population, particularly here in the West, but also it's starting to become evident in other parts of the world as well. To what extent do you think that's driving some of these other
Well, I think it makes being a politician harder. When everybody died at 50, you had a population where most people, and remember 100 years ago, or certainly 120 years ago, 50 was the average age of death in Britain. So when everybody dies at 50, you've got a load of people who can just about remember being teenagers and things, and so that when people, the modal age of death moves to, for women, 88 or something like that, which is what it is in many Western countries now. You've got a much broader range of experience. Couple that with a much broader range of income distribution. I think one of the most striking things I've seen in the last few years has been what income distribution looked like in many countries 100 years ago, which is clustered around quite a narrow peak, compared to what income distribution looks like now. And what you see, instead of this being clustered around a fairly sort of narrow peak, you've got a much broader sort of range of shallow mountains, if you like, which are much further apart. And that means the lived experience between people in countries becomes much harder. We can see that in the divisions in India, in Thailand, between the rural areas, between an urban and rapidly pacing urban populations. You can see it almost in Britain, in France, in America, the Gilets jaunes, the left behind, the Midwest, you name it. And so there is something about diversity of age and geography and income that is making actually it harder for politicians to unite people. Couple that with the internet fracturing audiences into, linear TV is slowly dying. So we do have a few things like the World Cup or the Queen's funeral that will bring together massive global or national audiences. But actually, increasingly, people are able to go and find their own channel, the thing that they're particularly interested in. And that's great, but it means that it's becoming harder. In some ways, it's becoming harder to unite people around a common set of values, a common set of beliefs. I mean, again, all of this can be overplayed, but I think these structural challenges are why our democracy, which never gives anybody what they want, it just gives more people a bit of what they want, or a compromise. That's what political parties are for. They're for compromise. They're not to give you the personal Ainsley political party, which would be different than the Ben political party, and would be different from our camera operators' political parties, if we got exactly what we wanted. So politics is always about a bit of what you want. But when the populations are more dispersed, geographically different, more different by age, I think it's a real challenge. Couple that with the productivity challenges that many societies face, the need to sustain and support aging populations in countries like not only Japan, but of course, interestingly now, South Korea. You've got challenges. China is going to have major challenges. We've had a massive demographic dividend of the last 50, 60 years. First, by getting women to go to work. Our secret source for much of the world of the last 70 years or so has simply been getting women to leave home and go to work. That makes them more productive. Then we had lots of babies after World War II and into the 60s. That's good too. Lots more young workers. All of that is now over. All of the gains that we achieved from that are now over. That it may be vital, actually, for humanity's continued presence on this planet if we stop expanding at the rate, and at the rate we have been. And my colleague's book, The Empty Planet, of course, examines that if we get through the 21st century in one piece, the 22nd century may mean that humanity's finally got itself on a sort of sustainable trajectory. We've just got to get through the next 80 years or so.
Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed. Do you think we need to view inequality in a different way than the way we have traditionally, and think about it in terms of socioeconomics. Do you think there are other angles on this we now need to be examining more closely?
Well, we already are, aren't we? So we're now very interested in ethnicity, in culture, in identity, as well as socioeconomic differences. I think the challenge is that many of those cultural, ethnic and other divisions are also reflected in the socioeconomic data and the economic data. So I'm still, don't tell anybody, I'm still a Marxist with a small m. I still think that it is actually ultimately the economy stupid that drives a lot of uneasiness and unhappiness, more than respecting other sorts of cultural differences. Behind all of those cultural differences, culture wars and everything else, to me, is often still the boring old science of economics.
So in our survey that we did this time last year, asking people to predict what they thought would happen in 2022, I noticed that people living in China, 83% of them thought that people in their country would become more tolerant of each other over the course of 2022, which in the recent weeks seems to have been somewhat challenged.
I'm not sure what that tells us about tolerance or intolerance. I mean, I think they've kept a population of over 1 billion people under a pretty tight lockdown. It would be like, you want to go from Paris to Lyon, or from Bonn to Hamburg, or from London to Liverpool, and you had to go into 3 days quarantine in order to make the journey. I mean, so I think that the protests that we've seen in China and the elite's response to those protests, which we'll come on to, doesn't necessarily indicate a declining tolerance or a rising tolerance or anything of the sort. It just indicates the absolute frustration that the Chinese population has had with 2 years of lockdown and very restrictive measures on their individual liberty. And it shows that the Chinese government, despite being pretty monolithic, pretty authoritarian, does actually sort of listen. Interesting, even in Russia, we now learn that the government itself does its own private polling through the Federal Guard, and has sort of let it be leaked or let it be known that only 1 in 4 Russians now support the war, which I found fascinating. So even very autocratic regimes actually seem to use social research in various ways and opinion polls to understand what is going on. So no, I'm not sure. I think China is fascinating because, of course, if it does unlock, let's hope that the fact that there's still a large proportion of over 80s who are not vaccinated, that the local vaccines are less effective than things like the Pfizer, means that they may have to go back into lockdowns if too many people are hospitalized. And I think it's a very uneasy situation. But overall, net, if you're interested in economic growth, and many people listening to this will be, then the unlocking of China is a huge part of that, particularly as actually this year it's been a huge break on global growth.
Well, that's actually my sinister kind of intention by asking that question about China, was really because I wondered whether you discerned that some of the unrest in China, some of the discontent may be driven by the fact that economic growth there is actually seeming to grind to a bit of a halt. The dividend you talked about before is kind of been exhausted there, and obviously we've seen issues with the property fund crashing, and then obviously the lockdowns as well, and their demographics are not favourable at the moment. And I wondered if you observed any of that perhaps driving some of the unrest there.
Well, it's simply frustration at the apparently arbitrary nature of the lockdown, as far as I can see. It's not aging per se that's driving that, but I think what you will see, if depending on how the unlock goes, there is going to be a dividend at some point for the Chinese economy, and that's something that we've seen in the West, and of course, and in America, which has driven some of the inflation that we've seen. Inflation is still very low in China, and the concern about it is relatively low. So the question is, do we see more inflation pumped into the system? Certainly there will be more demand for energy. One of the reasons we've been able to get through the weaponizing of energy supplies by Putin in the West is because China wasn't as big a consumer. If Chinese demand for in heavy industry, etc., returns to quote unquote normal levels, then that's going to put more pressure on the global economy. But overall, it's probably unlocking China has to happen at some point. They can't run a society like that forever. The society itself is now showing that, and so they will need to come to terms with the virus. But it's certainly not without risk, however.
So, final question, if I may. You did earlier, we were talking about elections and we were talking about things being finely balanced and it could go either way. Now, I know you're not a huge football fan, but at the time of recording, we are 5 days away from your new home, taking on your ancestral home in a very important match of football. I just wondered what your view of the likely outcome of that was.
I'm going to say that the French probably win, but I think that I might just be being polite.
Thank you very much, Ben Page.